All right, thanks for joining us for the August meeting of the American Solidarity Party, our Zoom gathering. I'm Paul Peralt, the state coordinator for Minnesota. Thank you for taking some time to join us this evening. If you're new to our gathering, again, a special welcome to you. Just so you know, the American Solidarity Party is a growing political movement. It's growing as our two major parties continue to polarize, leaving many Americans without a party they can call home. If you'd like to learn more about us, please contact me. You can email it, or actually you can put your name and email in the chat, or just email us at minnesota@solidarity-party.org. I'll try and respond in a timely fashion. If you're not connected to us on Facebook, please do. Again, you'll see in the chat our Facebook public page as well as our member group. Just look for the American Solidarity Party otherwise. Now, tonight we're going to deal with one of the most contentious issues of our time, although the underlying problems have been part of our nation since before its founding. It's a problem that has manifested itself in numerous ways: injustice against those who have different ethnic, racial, and cultural backgrounds, racism, Jim Crow, redlining, internment camps, the displacement of indigenous people. The list is a rather long one. The American Solidarity Party has one of its core beliefs, the inherent dignity and worth of all people. This core principle calls us to stand up for social justice. If you were to go to the website for the American Solidarity Party, solidarity-party.org, you'd see this in the statement of principles concerning the issue of social justice. We affirm a special collective responsibility to the most vulnerable members of our society and call for societal structures that uphold the equal value and dignity of each person, regardless of any personal characteristics. This requires efforts to address systemic and historic injustices, including longstanding racial injustice, in a way that confronts inequities that disparage innate personal dignity. Big phrase. What does it mean in practical terms? Well, much of the modern debate around social justice seems to create more heat than light. And we're just wondering, is there another way? So that's why we wanted to have Dr. George Yancey join us today to talk about that. George Yancey is a professor of sociology at Baylor, and if you followed March Madness, you saw that the Bears had a pretty good year this past year. He also serves on our American Solidarity Party Board of Advisors. And when it comes to issues of racial and ethnic tensions, he has done some firsthand research and analysis to help draw his conclusions. They're written so far in two books: Transcending Racial Barriers Toward a Mutual Obligations Approach, and Beyond Racial Gridlock, Embracing Mutual Responsibility. Plus, if I'm right, George, this early next year, a new book is coming out, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, with that, by the way, his website, georgeyancey.com. George, I give you the floor. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Okay, do I have screen share capacities?
Oh, I can give that to you in, just hold on a moment. And I'm making you a co-host.
Okay, great.
There you go.
All right. Probably like most of you all, I'm pretty new to the American Solidarity Party. Did I do the right screen?
Yep, we have your
Okay.
It's just showing, it shows the full, what's the program instead of just the slide. There you go.
Okay, good. Like probably a lot of you all, I'm pretty new to the whole, even the idea of a third party, because like you, I was growing up told, hey, you have to go for one part or the other, which means that you either get this bag or this bag, and you don't have the freedom to pick and choose. And so one of the attractions I find in going third party, I voted Solidarity Party in 2016 and 2020 for the presidential level. And when they run people down here in Texas, I'll be voting for them on the local level as well. And one of the nice things about going third party is you realize that they've been lying to you. You don't have to pick just this bag or this bag. You can pick and choose. You can find the path that you want. And so with that in mind, let me suggest that that same mentality has plagued our discussion on racial issues. People tell you either have to do this or do that. And I'm here to tell you no, that there is a different way. Now, how much of this fits in with the Solidarity Party. I think it does, but of course, I don't have the final say on that. But I think that it does. I think it fits in with the notion of community, building community. And to the degree that we want to do that in this party, I think that what I'm going to talk about is going to help do that. Whereas the other two methods, I just don't think work out. And so I'm going to frame this in the sense of a third racial path for a third party. And so to look at this, what we have to do is look first at what the other two parties have given us. So this is overgeneralized, and I realize, and there's exceptions in both parties. But I just want to concentrate on that for a second. First thing I want to talk about Republicans' views about racism. And I want to be clear about this. I think when it comes to racism, most of us will recognize the issues are out there. Now, how we're going to solve it is a lot of disagreements, but most individuals in the United States recognize that you should not mistreat people because of their race. They recognize some degree of inequality that's out there. So given that, how do we tackle that? And what I have seen is that for Republicans, they generally tackle it something like this. That racism is something that's overt and only done from one individual to another individual. And thus for them, the solution is colorblindness. Now, what do we mean by colorblindness? I would say something like this. This is from a Republican study committee. As Republicans, we reject the racial essentialism that critical race theory teaches. So one of the first things to start off with is, we don't like critical race theory because it teaches that, there's something inherent about us in our race. Now, I'm not saying that they're right. I'm just saying that this is the point of view they come from. We believe that individuals should be judged based on the content of their character, not their skin. They're tapping into Martin Luther King, which is controversial. And we believe that America's institutions should be colorblind, just as our Constitution is colorblind. The same vision shared by civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. So this is the attitude that I think you find on the right, if you will, that the way we deal with racism is we ignore race. We say, hey, I don't see your color. I don't see your skin color. You're the same as I am. So a colorblindness perspective. And this is pretty popular among those on the right, in the Republican Party. It is the ideal used to combat the efforts they think are wrong that come from Democrats, and I'll get to their stuff in a little bit. This is the perspective. Now, for this to work, for colorblindness to work, we have to have a society that is at least somewhat fair. In other words, we can't be colorblind if there's still inequities out there, and inequities that just won't go away just by ignoring them. So given that, we can ask the question, is colorblindness viable? And research would suggest that it is not. For example, this study finds that over the past 25 years, there's been no decrease in racial discrimination as concerns hiring. And they know this by something called audit studies. And an audit study is basically when you take a Black or Latino person and a white person, and you send them both to get a job, and you see who gets called back. And they've done this for about 25 years, and there's more to it than just that, but just in simplicity, that's what it is. And what they find over the past 25 years, that whites get called back and Blacks and Latinos are less likely to be called back. And this has not decreased over the past 25 years. So it's not that it was really bad 25 years ago, it's better now. It's bad 25 years ago, it's bad today. Society is not fair. There's also what we call driving while Black. And this is the notion that if you're an African-American, you're more likely to be pulled over than if you're white. And research by Harris shows that this is indeed the case. Now, he's only looking at Ohio. There's other research that looks at other parts of the country. But in the final analysis, if you're an African-American and you control for all the other factors, speeding, what have you, you're more likely to be pulled over by a police officer. And this is tied into all sorts of problems with the criminal justice system. Because we know that African Americans are more likely to be arrested, all things being equal, more likely to be charged, all the things being equal, more likely to be found guilty, all other things being equal, and found guilty, serve longer sentences, all other things being equal. So this is representative of a larger criminal justice system that is not fair. Residential segregation still impacts the educational outcomes of people of color. So because of the fact that you live in Black areas of town and white areas of town and Hispanic areas of town, that you send your kids to white schools, Black schools, Hispanic schools. And to be quite frankly, as this research shows, those white schools are better for kids than the Black and Hispanic schools. So the kids can be of same quality as far as their abilities and their training. But you go to a better school, you have a better chance to get into a college, to get a better college, to get ahead. So once again, it's not fair. We can't be colorblind in this. And then this is interesting, that there's evidence of racism in the beliefs and practices in medical healthcare providers. They looked at 37 studies, and 26 of them, they found that they documented racism in how they saw their patients, racism in what they would recommend, that they treat people differently, that the treatment that people of color are getting medically is not the same treatment that whites are getting. Now, we know on the surface that people don't, there's not a lot of very overt racists today. And people say that, and I'm not one to say, well, you say you're not overt racist, but you really are. You don't get anywhere with that. But we still have structures and practices that work against people of color. To be colorblind to that is to ignore that, and ignoring that just does not work out. You're a person of color, you can't just ignore the fact that society still works against you. So the Republican views doesn't work. Well, what about a Democrat view about racism? Because they obviously are not going the colorblind route, they're doing something different. Well, here's what you can say about the Democrats. That they will argue that racism is structural as well as individualistic, and social institutions can perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. And so a lot of what they relied upon is something called anti-racism. And anti-racism programs in order to try to address racism that is structural and individualistic, and to be very intentional about being very aggressive about going after racism. And this is a Democrat California legislature, and I've never heard the name said, so I'm not going to try to say it. You can read the name for yourself. But this legislature, this is just a representative. You can find other examples. We should be talking about mandatory training for anti-racism. We should be talking about diversity and inclusion training for all county employees. So for the Democrats, the solution is, let's get this racism training, anti-racism training, and make it mandatory. Put people through it, and we'll train this racism out of folks. And so there's a lot of what we call anti-racism that's out there. So let me just define it for us real quick. Anti-racism is very proactive in approach. It's not about waiting to see if there is racism. You assume there is racism, and you go and you try to tackle it right off the bat. It focuses on unfair advantages or privileges of being white. So anti-racism training is a lot about talking about white privilege, talking about dealing with whiteness, the advantages whites have, and how we can neutralize those advantages. It talks about implicit bias, indicates hidden racism, so that they point at implicit bias research and say people may not know that they're racist, but it's there regardless. One thing about anti-racism is it talks about we have to dismantle racism in all aspects of it. Individually, in our social structures, all aspects of racism have to be tackled. There's talk about what they call ending whiteness. Now, some people will say, well, are you talking about genocide? And the answer is clearly no. When they talk about ending whiteness, though, often they talk about ending things associated with European Americans, European American culture, that they would argue gives whites an unfair advantage, creates a society that is not fair to people of color, that is tied to some of these cultural norms and values found within European American society. That's what they usually mean by ending whiteness. Now, other people may mean different things, but that's generally what they mean. And then they talk about folks on listening to people of color rather than having whites taking over. And so there's a big emphasis. And one thing I did was I read the literature by anti-racists themselves. I read the primary literature. So I didn't want to just say, well, this is what people have said about it. I wanted to read the literature. And this is pretty clear. that in the literature, it often talks about what whites are to do. In fact, it cuts you a lot more talking to whites than talking to people of color. If you really read the literature. And it says whites, listen, don't interject yourself, do what people of color want you to do. Some say give money to things, some say go talk to other white people to bring them on board. But the focus is on getting whites to do the right thing. And that's the focus of anti-racism. And that's part of anti-racism training for the most part. There may be some exceptions out there, but it wasn't in the books that I read. Okay, is this approach successful? Well, one thing when we look at research is there's some reasons to suspect that it's not successful. For example, when we have remedies justifying on moving resources from whites to non-whites, which is a lot of the anti-racism literature is about, it often produces resistance. In other words, when we talk about, we need to do this because we need to take the resources from whites and give them to non-whites. And we can talk about how just that is and how fair that is and what have you. What you're going to tend to get is a lot of people saying, I'm out on that and I'm going to fight that. And so you can have this program, but people are going to resist this program and they're going to sabotage the program when they get a chance to. What could have changed attitudes? Well, diversity training of a lot of different sorts is seen to have little long-term effect on prejudice. What happens, and this is done by a meta-analysis, so it's a lot of different studies, it's not just one study. So what happens is that their prejudice will be reduced immediately. So you do a diversity training course, your prejudice goes down immediately. And then you come back 6 months later and you give them a survey and it's back to where it was. So putting people through anti-racism training or diversity training, it doesn't really change them long-term. You can get a short-term bump, but you really don't get this sort of long-term change. So you really have to ask the question, is it worth it? Compelling whites to do anti-racism training can create a backlash against people of color. This is significant. What can happen, and what research suggests happens is you say, okay, you do anti-racism training, we're gonna make it mandatory. And once you do that, what can happen is that some of those whites go, okay, I may have to be forced to do that training. But when I get out of that training, I'm going to even be harsher against people of color because I had to do this. So the actions are not changing in ways that we would hope for them to change. In fact, I'm going to look at some research later that really shows how this could really backfire. And then teaching about privilege can create less sympathy for whites, but does not increase sympathy for people of color. This research was interesting. It looked at programs that taught whites about white privilege. The idea was to make them more sympathetic to people of color. And it didn't. The attitudes for people of color did not change. What did change was less sympathy towards marginalized whites. And so you talked about a person who was homeless or very poor or in a domestic violence situation. The attitude was, well, but you have this white privilege, so why should you be in this bad situation? There's other research on teaching privilege that shows that it's not that effective. But what really it might do is create less sympathy overall for marginalized folks. No more sympathy for people of color and less sympathy for whites who are marginalized. So people said, let's do anti-racism, let's be very proactive, let's go and let's teach people. But the research is coming back and it's not working. Now, we can feel good about anti-racism, and there are aspects of it that I agree with, but when the research says something's not working, then the wise thing to do is to accept that and then move on to see what could work. Now, I have my reasons why I think both of these approaches fail. I think they both fail for the same reason, even though what they're trying to do is quite different, as you can see. I think they both fail because they attempt to make others capitulate to a predetermined solution. What's happened is, whether it's colorblindness or anti-racism, people said, look, here's a solution. When you accept our solution, things will be great. If you do not accept our solution, then things go down. And so I got to get you to, even if I have to force you to accept our solution, that's what we have to do. Let me give you an example in my personal life on colorblindness, how this was, how this came to me. And I can find examples of anti-racism as well, but I'll just do colorblindness for right now. About a year ago, I'm on Facebook, and I have three boys, a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And the 6-year-old at that time was 5, and he was getting to the point where I was talking to him about birds and the bees, but also I want to talk to him about racial issues. And there's a lot of literature out there on how to talk to your kid about sex. Not a lot of literature out there on how to talk to your kid about race. And I wanted something good. And so I went to Facebook, and I have a lot of friends who are people of color themselves, or their wives raising kids of color. And so I said, hey, have y'all found some good approaches to talking to kids about racial issues? And I got some advice, but I also got a lot of pushback on a question that was, I wasn't talking about George Floyd. I wasn't talking about taking down statues. I wasn't talking about anything political. Raising my boys. And the pushback I got was this: why are you bringing up the topic of race to your boys? Raise them to be good men and don't worry about race. Race is unimportant. Why are you even bringing it up? It's not that important. So basically, what a lot of these people were saying was, they're trying to tell me as an African American how to raise my boys and to ignore race. Why? Because this is a predetermined solution, and I have to capitulate to that to make it work. Now, as I said, you can find examples of anti-racism as well, but that's the problem with both of these approaches. So with that in mind, I now can introduce a third approach, what I call a collaborative conversations approach. And this is basically this: working together to form healthy interracial communications so that we can solve racial problems. So we work together, we try to solve racial problems in a healthy communication, not one where we come in with predetermined solutions and try to force someone into our solutions. Now, that does not mean that we do not engage in what I call moral suasion. In fact, we do engage in moral suasion. We do try to convince people that what I'm pushing is right, and you try to convince me what you're pushing is right. But we don't do it in a way that turns people off. This is not a pastor on the street corner preaching, hellfire and damnation. This is not a professor in a classroom forcing Karl Marx down on students who don't want to accept Karl Marx. Not learn about it, accept it. That's not what this is. Moral suasion. In fact, here's what research says moral suasion done rightly is about. If you want to do moral suasion correct, if you want to persuade people, here's how you do it. First, you identify agreement. You find out, where do you agree with them? Where do you have commonalities? Is my goals the same as your goals? Are my values the same as your values? Maybe we have different ideas how to get there. Let's see where we agree before we get into what we disagree. You admit when other people have a good point. You show that's not just your goal to beat them down and force them to capitulate to your point of view. They may have a good point you have to take into consideration, and you admit that. You're willing to admit that. You build rapport. You build rapport with other people. You find out, develop the sort of feelings of care and concern. Do you actually care about people? How much better will we be as a society if we did not try to change someone's perspective until we actually cared about that person, not just so they can come to our political ideology? And you try to actively understand the arguments of others. You don't try to distort their arguments. You don't say, well, oh, you don't like Black Lives Matter, therefore you must be a racist. Or you like Black Lives Matter, therefore you hate white people. No, where are they coming from? What's their actual argument and why do they have it? Can you articulate their perspective in a helpful way? These are things that we do in order to build moral suasion. Engaging in moral suasion is a superior to what we usually do. What we usually do is we usually try to engage in power. We usually try to force people to do what we think they ought to do. Now, there is a time for power. At times, power is necessary, but carries serious shortcomings. As I said, I'm raising a 3, a 4, and 6-year-old. Do you think I never use power? Of course I do. If I did not use power to get them to do what they need to do, they'd still be up right now going crazy, instead of in bed right now. They'd be eating candy all the time, and they'd fight with their brothers without eating. Of course, I come in, I use power at times. I also recognize that there's a limit to using power. As they get older, I have to, and even my 6-year-old now, I have to use power less than I did when he was 2 or 3. And because as you get older, you don't want a relationship built upon power. We can use political power, we can use social power, we can use physical power, we can use all sorts of power to get people to do what we want. But at some point, they will rebel from that. So there's times where power is necessary, no doubt. But we have to be aware of its shortcomings. Moral suasion, not power, is necessary to produce lasting change. Developing those connections, developing that rapport, that can produce lasting change. That can alter where people come from. Usually with power, you can alter a person's actions, but not their heart. Moral suasion, you have a chance to alter their heart. And here's what I really like. Moral suasion builds community. Power builds compliance. So we have to decide, what do we want? Do we want to be with these folks and be in community with them? Do we want to learn where their hurts are and take care of their hurts and pains as they take care of our hurts and pains? Work together, build a community. Or do we want them to comply with us? Because power will get you compliance. And as long as you have that power over that person, you can probably keep that compliance. Or do we want community with them? We are so polarized as a society because what we do, what we want, the political games we play, is about compliance and not community. Collaborative conversations is about using moral suasion instead of power. When we engage in a collaborative conversation, when we try to persuade with moral suasion instead of trying to force with power, this is what it's about. Can we find answers? Can we find solutions in collaboration with one another, rather than find solutions where I decide what the solution is, and then my goal, my purpose, is to get you to agree with my solution. And if I fail to do that, then I failed. Or can we find a way in which you can work with me? Now, is there empirical work that this could work? And I believe there is. For example, we know that under the right conditions, interracial contact helps to alleviate bias. There's research that shows that whenever you have this sort of contact, when people of different races have contact with one another, that there's less bias develops. Now the conditions have to be right. Contact by itself is not sufficient. What are the right conditions? We can reduce bias. We can reduce hatred to one another. Collaborative conversations is part of those sort of conditions. Having a common group identity increases positive feelings. The more we see ourselves as being in the same group together, and less as us and them, but us and us, the more we do that, then the more positive feelings that we have towards one another. Now, sometimes we develop an us and us by creating a new them that we then hate. The challenge is, can we create a sort of a universal us together? And that's going to be tough, but if we can do that, we can find solutions where we take everyone's ideas and concerns into consideration. Research has shown that families with a collaborative orientation have more positive interactions and relations with each other. And so families that their orientation is to work together rather than compete against each other, that there's more positive interactions, more positive relationships than families that are more competitive against each other. And collaborative communication in an atmosphere of mutual support creates voluntary compliance. And I think this is a key one. Remember, the research shows that you do anti-racism training, you get a backlash, you get resistance. So let's say you can get some power, you get some political power, you get 60% of the country to vote for you. and you can start imposing whatever you want to impose, colorblindness, anti-racism on people. 40% of the country is going to feel imposed upon, and they're not going to have volitional compliance. What they're going to do is they're going to sabotage. They're going to make things worse. They're going to do what we see Democrats and Republicans do all the time. When the one group gets power, the other group's going to sabotage them. They're not going to work together. Collaborative communications, though, creates an atmosphere where instead of sabotaging other folks, we work with other folks to find lasting solutions. Now, I like this study because this is really I believe, the clearest comparison between a more of an anti-racism approach and a collaborative conversation approach. It's a study by Dobbins and Calvage in 2016. What they did was they studied 829 mid-sized and large US firms. They documented the efforts of these firms to increase minority representation among managers. So they went to these firms and they documented, all right, what are you doing to increase minority representation among managers? How are we going to get more people of color and women, they were looking at women as well. How are we going to get more people of color to become managers, not just workers, but managers? What are you doing? So they went to all these companies and found out what they're doing in order to try to increase their racial diversity of managers. Then they came back 5 years later and they looked, did they have more managers? Did they have more managers of color? So they knew what they're trying to do. Come back 5 years later, okay, did it succeed? 5 years is enough time to see whether or not it succeeded or not. And that's why this is such a good study. It's actually looking at what people are doing and looking at results. So it's not theory, what we want to do, what actually works. Here's what they found out. That mandatory anti-racism training is correlated with a decreased representation. Okay, just hear that? If you go to a company and what they're doing is mandatory anti-racism training, you come back 5 years later, they're gonna have fewer managers of color there on average. And I can follow up with the precise numbers you want, but fewer managers of color there on average. But if what you do is you take the white manager there and you bring them into a conversation, go to the white manager and say, hey, how can we increase managers of color? I'm gonna make you in charge of recruitment. I'm gonna make you in charge of our diversity task force. I'm gonna make you in charge of mentoring. You do that, and you come back 5 years later, and you have increased diversity among the managers. You bring people into conversation, you get better results. You dictate to people, you say, you're gonna go through this anti-racism training, and you're gonna learn on how to end whiteness, and you come back 5 years later, and you actually have fewer managers of color because of resistance. People will resist your efforts. Okay, I'm just gonna go real quickly through this. I mean, I've been talking, this has been in theory as far as cloud conversation. So how would we do this? What sort of steps would be in order to do this? And so I just wanna touch on that a little bit. I have talks where I go much more in details as to practical ways of doing this. But I just want to touch on this to show that this isn't just theory, that I've thought about how you would actually do a cloud conversation approach. And so what would you do in order to try to deal with a racial problem in a collaborative conversations approach? First thing you do is you try to define the racial problem. I think about it this way. Solve one problem at a time. If you're in a relationship, solve one problem at a time, right? If you try to solve all the problems, you solve no problems. When you concentrate on that one problem, try to solve that, and you move to the next problem. Same thing. Don't try to solve all the problems at once. Solve this one, then go to the next. In fact, you solve this one, you now have some experience in how to solve problems, so you can go to the next one, right? So define the racial problem you're going to deal with at that point in time. Is it going to be about policing, community policing? Is it going to be about what we do with Confederate statues? Is it going to be about, I don't know, critical race theory in our schools? It used to be multiculturalism was the big bugaboo. Now it's critical race theory in our schools. What is the issue that we need to talk about, that we need to deal with? And let's just concentrate on that issue. Let's not just start in on critical race theory in schools and then go talk about a General Lee statue all across the city. That's an important problem too, important issue too. But if you jump around, you're not going to get anywhere. And then identify the critical core. Identify what you have in common. Try to find commonalities. What's in common and what you don't have in common. All right? But focus in on, hey, we agree on this and we agree on that. Recognize the cultural and racial differences at play. So once you know, okay, we agree on this. This is our goals and values, same outcomes perhaps. We disagree though on how to get there. We disagree perhaps on these values. We disagree on this perspective. So this gives us insight as to, all right, we agree here, we disagree here. We clearly know we don't have to deal with this, we agree here. We clearly know what we have to deal with right here. And then understand the other perspectives. Don't just say, okay, here's what you all are doing. And if they say, no, that's not how we see it, then you didn't get it. Understand where other people are coming from. And don't assume that you know where they're coming from when you're basing it on your own presuppositions. Recognize those differences at play. Learn how to listen to others so that you can see what's at play. And then try to develop ideas that address the concerns of your racial outgroup or the people on their side, even if they're of the same race. So if you understand why you disagree with them and what the differences are, now you can develop ideas that meet your needs, and you're going to develop ideas that meet your needs, but also can try to meet their needs. Maybe they say it doesn't meet their needs enough, but at least you're now beginning to think about how can we find solutions that we can all win? Because collaborative conversation is about win-win instead of win-lose approaches. How can we figure out ways in which we can all win together? And then this sets us up so we can work towards a solution that can be accepted by all. Now, do I mean that every single person in the country has to accept the solution? Of course, that's not realistic, and it's not going to happen that way. And let's just dispense with that, because I've heard people critique me saying, oh, everyone has to agree, and therefore we'll never get anything done. No. Well, we can find better solutions that a lot of people all across the spectrum can agree on. And we can work together towards finding those solutions. So if we listen to others, and we try to find solutions that meet their needs, and they try to do the same for us, it's not a one-way street, then we can work towards finding somewhere in the middle. We may not always get there, but we're a lot better off than being polarized and fighting one another, because that's what we're doing today on race relations. I just want to touch on the implications of this, and then I'll open up for questions and feedback and see where y'all are at. The implications of this approach. First implication is no one has all the right answers. I don't have the right answers. I've been studying race for decades now, published books and peer-reviewed articles on it. I know I don't have all the right answers. I realize that. I think I have a lot of good answers, but I don't have all of them. We can get better answers by listening to each other. And that's an art form that we are lacking in this country. We know how to tear down people who disagree with us. We don't know how to listen to those who disagree with us. And that's something we need to learn how to do. We need intentional efforts at collaborative conversations. It's not just going to happen. This is not, hey, we need a conversation, when what I really mean is, I need a monologue on topic. We have to intentionally go into this and say, I want a collaborative conversation where we're going to listen and talk. Now, I'm not always ready for a collaborative conversation in all areas of my life. I'll admit that. Maybe I need to work on that more in my life. But so I have to know, okay, this is a problem. I need to listen. And hopefully this person needs to listen to me. And we need to see what we can find out. The needs of everyone must be respected. The needs of everyone must be respected. Now, I'm going to say something that sounds like it might contradict what I've been talking about, but it really doesn't. I think when we start engaging in this, I think when we make adjustments, why is it going to make greater adjustments than people of color, given our racial history? All right. Now, technically, for this to work, all solutions have to be on the table. And sometimes the best solution may be, hey, everyone has the same responsibility. I think if we actually did this and we start communicating and understanding one another, I think what we're going to find is that the solutions are going to, where everyone's going to have to give, whites are probably going to give a little bit more. And I'm okay with that if it's the end of useful conversation. Because if we've done that, then we've respected everyone's needs. And if whites are giving more, they've not been forced to give more, but they've seen through conversation that this is the best way forward. And they're not going to sabotage because they don't feel like being dragged out of it, because their needs were respected. And one of the ways anti-racism goes wrong, when you read the literature, it's pretty clear. The needs of whites is not respected in anti-racism literature, just isn't. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's not worked. Skills of active listening and productive communication is valued. People have to learn how to listen to others. How do we listen in ways in which we understand where they're coming from? How do we engage in listening that's not for arguing's sake, but so that I understand your point of view? And how do I communicate? How do I talk in the language of the listener? How do I talk to people so that they understand where I'm coming from and they can perceive what I'm trying to tell them? That it's not something that is going to trigger them unnecessarily. That it's not something that's going to make them unnecessarily defensive. I can get through to them. What good is it? You know, one of the things that sometimes people do is they use words that they know is going to make people defensive. And I'll just give a couple examples on terms that make people defensive. For example, some people who get to colorblindness will say, I don't see color. Right? A person of color says, my color is important to who I am. If I just told you my color is important to who I am, then what are you telling me when you say you don't see color? You're saying that what's important to who I am is not important. Now, that may be where you're at. You got to find better ways of communicating for me to receive that. Or here's another example. When people like to throw out white supremacy, and they don't mean Klan or white nationalism or that sort of thing. They say, you know, this is about white supremacy when they're talking about the way capitalism works, or this is white. Well, I know that for most whites, that makes them defensive. They feel like they're attacked. And you can go on and explain, no, I don't mean that you're like the Klan. It doesn't matter. You've already said those words and they're already defending themselves. We got to learn how to communicate in ways where people can hear us, or it doesn't do any good. You can score points for your team, but you're not going to break through. And I've mentioned this. The work is towards win-win solutions instead of win-lose solutions. Win solutions are lose solutions are out. I'm not trying to win by making you pay. You shouldn't be trying to win by making me pay. We can find something where we're all happy, and that's great. I don't know how many of you are married. The best solutions are win-win. You know, you occasionally can have a win-lose solution where you win, your spouse loses. You're going to pay for that later on. Okay, you're going to pay for that later on because they don't want to have a situation where they win. But if you can both win, I know it's not always possible. If you can both win, then you're building on each other. You're making things better for each other. So what we want is win-win solutions. It may not always be possible. That should be our goal every single time. So those are some implications of this approach. I think it's the third approach. I think it fits in with what we're trying to do at the American Solidarity Party. And I'd be happy at this point to end the show and take questions as you all see fit. So let me do my stop share. Okay. So I don't know how you want to do it, Paul. If you want them to just ask me or send me a chat, however you want to do it.
Well, let's start because there are a few things that popped into the chat. Amy, would you be willing to bring your question up?
Sure. I'd really love to hear like some real life examples of when you've used this approach with a group. Tell some stories, what works well, what have you seen work well? How long does the conversation go on? Like, it seems like it would take a long time.
Yeah, I suspect the conversation is, it's not going to be the instant solution, which, people look for. I can give you a couple of examples of situations, and I'm working right now with some churches to learn more on how to do this more effectively, and hopefully to publish some research on it. But, one example I would give is an organization called Game Changers. They're located, I believe, I want to say Los Angeles, maybe San Diego, but I think it's Los Angeles. Basically, it's an ex-football player who is working with the community. He's an African American. And what he's doing is bringing in police officers and people with the community together. And they'll have an event, and they'll have a fun event, and then people will come together and they'll have a conversation. And I don't have any long-term research on this, but short-term, the attitudes of the people in the community is much more favorable to the police officers afterwards, and the attitudes of the police officers is much more favorable to people of color afterwards. And so that's one example. I've heard another organization that's not doing this on race, but doing this in general. I want to, I can't remember the name of that organization. Paul, if you contact me later on, I'll try to remember. Another example I know, as far as a personal example that I've seen, is there's this African-American guy who, and he has this video, and I think it's a TED talk of some sort. And it's when he went undercover as part of the alt-right. So he went undercover as part of the alt-right with his social media. So he created social media, and and then he went in there. And so he just wanted to learn where people were getting some crazy ideas that he heard. And he saw these crazy ideas, but then in the middle of that, he heard these, people who, for lack of a better term, are racist, start talking about, what? I just don't want to be judged because I'm white. I don't want people to say, oh, you're white and therefore you're this way and that way. He said, you know what? I didn't expect that, but that resonated with me. Because as an African-American man, I know what it's like to be judged for my skin color too. And I'm not saying the same thing, but when someone says that, and so I think if you Google undercover for alt-right, I think you'll come up with that. It's a very powerful video of what happens when we, at least temporarily, put ourselves in another person's shoes, and someone's shoes that we think we have nothing in common with. Sometimes we learn we do have something in common with them. So we're seeing some of these snatches. There's research on this as far as how collaborative conversations work with counseling relationships, with educational relationships. If you look at our education system, sometimes what they teach is how do you engage collaborative conversations. They know it works in that sort of setting. So we know it works in other settings. We have some situations where we're seeing it's working. I'm working on research to look at, so I can document this and learn how to do this and show that it can work in racial settings. What I'm saying is the research suggests that this should work. Now, we need to dive into it and do it, but the research has shown that the other stuff doesn't work. And so that's sort of where I'm at right now. So those are a few examples I can think of on the top of my head.
All right, and Cindy also is in the chat field there. Cindy, did you want to ask the question on Mike? Or should we take that as a no?
Am I unmuting?
There you go.
I'm looking at my questions and I'm not sure that they make sense in the conversation now. In part, I'm looking at something I'm feeling like it's a little bit like a management perspective that a couple of companies I worked for had, where rather than the managers coming up with a solution to a problem and telling the employees, they found it was much better for the employees themselves who were doing the job to come up with the solutions to how to better do the job. And there was a certain ownership of that. So am I getting that right? That it's kind of what you're looking at, not a top-down solution, but a bottom-up solution?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I don't know if that's exactly do it that way. I think the key is that when people feel, I think part of what you're saying is ownership. So when people feel like they own the solution, they had input into the solution, then they're going to work harder at making the solution work, and the solution is more likely to work. So I think that part is definitely true. I would, I definitely suggest that, yes.
Okay, and kind of related to that then, I'm coming from the same church as Amy Anderson does. That's kind of where the connection was. And in Minneapolis, when George Floyd was killed, I think those of us, we do have a few people of different colors in our church. It's a small church, but we're a mainly white church. And I think there was a certain amount of angst in where do we as a white church fit into this situation? How do we bring about, racial unity between the churches? And I'm wondering if maybe that isn't just too big a question, if we should be breaking it down more and, like looking for how do we fit as a white church into this issue or that issue?
Yeah, I think that's a
I
good
don't know if
question. Before I answer that question, I just put in the chat room the title to A Black Man Goes Undercover, other TED Talk, Black Man Goes Undercover, right? Someone wants to look that up. I think that, all right, I think one danger white churches have is when they want to jump too fast, too soon. Because you got to realize that, we've had centuries of this sort of racial abuse. And so, and sometimes churches of color will lash back out. And I'm not always saying it's fair, but sometimes it will happen. So, what we want to get to is to the point to where if something like George Floyd happens, we already have the relationships to have the conversation. If you wait till after George Floyd has happened and then say, okay, now let's have the conversation, you don't have those relationships. And so, so the only thing you can do is start now building those relationships to when the next incident happens. I think it's a mistake to say, okay, George Floyd happened. Let's jump in and do da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And, African churches are not having it. You weren't there. And so here's my suggestion. If you want to start, and this is not thinking about what to do about George Floyd, okay? So I'll be clear. What to do about George Floyd, that's happened, you're out. Find a church, an African-American church, find out what they are working on, what they care about, walk alongside and work with them on that. To say, look, we don't want, you're all doing great things. We want to help you, maybe financially, maybe give you manpower. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to help and walk alongside and develop a relationship with you. And, that would be a start. This is not a short-term process, obviously. You start developing those relationships so that when the next thing happens, there's a chance in which you could have that sort of communication, that sort of conversation. Mm-hmm. So that's how, whenever I had white churches come and talk to me about what should we do, I've sort of discouraged them from jumping right on in. I said, build a relationship first. And then next time something happens, hopefully you have enough of a relationship where you can start those sort of conversations.
Thank you.
Might help if I mute there. Anyway, George, I really appreciate this. And as you're going through all this stuff, I'm kind of thinking, wow, there's so many other ways this could be applied. Not just on the racial, you already mentioned that, but I mean, there's so many other issues. If there would be a little more, again, taking that solidarity approach of sitting down and having the hard conversations. But anyway, before we go, because we only have a few more minutes, does anybody else have a question? Just jump right in. Scott, do you have one?
I do have a question. I just want to know of the books that you've written on this topic, if we haven't really delved into your material, where would be the best place to start?
Of my books or of other books?
I'd like to start with your books.
Okay. I mean, I have a book coming out in February, which I think will be it'll be a better book because it's had more time. But if you don't want to wait, I do have a book that came out in 2006 called Beyond Racial Gridlock. And that book's written with a Christian publisher. If you would rather have a non-Christian version of it, I do have a book that came out in 2008 or 9 called Transcending Racial Barriers. That's an Oxford University Press one. I wrote that one, and I don't use any scriptures in that one. I basically use sociological theories in that one. So those are the two books I've written that would be most relevant to it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hey, George, what's the name of the book that's coming out in, early next year?
Beyond Racial Division.
Okay, cool.
And they like the beyond racial stuff on me. I don't know why, but they keep wanting to limit the beyond racial stuff.
All right. One more question if anybody has one. I'll take that as a no. Well, it is 8 o'clock. So again, thanks everybody for coming. Again, this will be posted on the Minnesota American Solidarity Party Minnesota Facebook page. George, again, thank you for joining us and thank you for this work
for
in
having
this
me.
area.
Thank you. God bless you all, y'all.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. And we hope to see you at the next meeting, probably the 4th Tuesday in September. So thanks again.